Welcome. We are in Lexington, Massachusetts on Friday, April 13th, 2018. I'm here with Professor Emeritus Dietmar Seyferth and Professor Emeritus Fred Greene, and we're here to discuss the history of the MIT Chemistry Department. I think we'll begin, perhaps, with when each of you first joined the department at MIT in the 1950s. And let's start by talking about how you first heard about the fact that there was a faculty position open at MIT, because I know things were different in those days. Today we have extensive requirements to advertise positions, to make sure that everyone in all four corners of the globe is aware that there's an opening on the MIT chemistry faculty. So perhaps, Fred, you were hired first, I believe. What year was that, and how did you learn about the opening?
In the year of 1952-53, I was a postdoc with Don Cram at UCLA. I had completed the PhD with Paul Bartlett at Harvard in the end of the summer of '52. At the time I entered graduate school, I was solely interested in getting ultimately into a teaching position. But as I learned about opportunities in research, in industrial research, I was kind of open to either a career in teaching or a career in industry.
Can I interrupt, Fred?
Yes.
That's an interesting point. In those days, how was industry viewed, and what fraction of people getting PhDs in chemistry in, say, Don Cram's group would go to academics versus industry?
Oh, Don Cram was still at a very early point in his career, and so I could not, I have no information in my head about where his students were going. But in the industrial area, I guess this was largely through talks that we heard at Harvard in the graduate program, and perhaps also with people who were interviewing candidates to go into industry. I don't know when I really became conscious of the fact that there were so many really good opportunities to do research in industry. DuPont was a place where they did a lot of basic research.
There were a lot of industrial people who came to interview the Harvard PhDs.
Yeah, you were both graduate students at Harvard. What do you think might have been the fraction of the PhDs at Harvard in your years that were going to industry?
Most of them still went to industry, yeah.
Yeah.
But significant amount went into teaching.
Was academics viewed as a more prestigious job?
I'm not
It
sure.
was
I
viewed
would put it
two ways. Prestige, yeah, but salary, no.
And there was a lot of really good research going on in industry, which was not the case, 20 years later, or maybe or sooner than that.
That's right.
But I would say there was no difficulty getting a job. Anybody coming out of the Harvard program or the UCLA one, I think there were just many opportunities. Wouldn't you say that?
Right.
You didn't have to, I think it was dealer's choice in that time.
For academic jobs as well?
Academic were much more limited.
Yeah.
I remember once, was it Jerry Burson with Woodward, and there was only one good opportunity. I'm not sure I have the name right, but there was one good one, and it was at USC, and he was very happy to get that. Yes, it was much more difficult to get into an academic job.
Because pre-Sputnik era, there were smaller faculties in chemistry, probably.
There was less funding.
Less funding, yeah. Well, getting back to, you're at UCLA with Don Cram.
And I was very interested in what I was doing, and Saul Winstein was in that department, so I went to all those, his group seminars and to Don Cram's, and I was still open to whether I'd go into industry or into academic. I came back in February to interview at University of Rochester, and also in the ESSO labs, I think in Chicago. And I was planning to do more interviews. but it wasn't a high priority to me, really, at that point, which way I would go. In the spring of 1953, there was an ACS meeting in Los Angeles. And I think that's the point at which I became conscious that there was an opening at MIT. And I don't know whether, maybe it was probably Don Cram called it to my attention, because Cope was looking for some more people to add to the staff at that stage. And so I think I didn't contact Sheehan, but John Sheehan, I guess, contacted me through Don Cram. And so I had an interview with John Sheehan, I guess, down at one of the hotels in Los Angeles. And I think that went well. It wasn't a very big deal. I hadn't submitted anything to him about applying for the job. But sometime after that, I learned that I got an offer from MIT to join the faculty.
So Sheehan contacted you. You knew that this lunch was concerning.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so, yes. And that must have gone through Don Cram. And it wasn't a really very long interview. I had a good impression of him. I did not know of him.
How
prior
old
to
was
that.
Sheehan? He was tenured
Well,
then, right?
I think he got the award in pure chemistry that was given to people 36 and under at that time, and so that would have been about his age, wouldn't it, Dietmar?
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah.
Did you talk about your research proposals?
Not a word.
What research proposals?
Was there any competition? Did you know if they were considering any other candidates?
Didn't come into the conversation.
Similar experience for you, Dietmar?
Well, Al Cotton had been my colleague at Harvard in the graduate program, and he had gone to MIT in '55 and found himself the only modern inorganic chemist among a number of other inorganic chemists, and he wanted some young fellow like to join him. He knew me and suggested to Cope that I come to MIT. So I was invited to give a seminar to the inorganic chemists, and I talked to Cope, and that was it. Got an appointment as instructor.
So what year was that?
57,
57.
year of Sputnik.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the more colorful figures in the department, Dietmar. Maybe what's your recollection of what Art Cope was like, and Al Cotton? Both of them are giant figures themselves in the history of chemistry.
Well, I didn't know Cope that well, but Al Cotton was very driven, very energetic, always ready for a fight. And he picked many, and he was out to be number one. And he pretty well was number one for quite some years. And he was right of Ronald Reagan, as we used to say, and got into fights in the elevator at the faculty club with some guy who was not that inclined to the right, and eventually he left and went to Texas A&M, where the political climate would be more to his liking, which was in 1971, which was too bad. But he got all the awards. He won all the gold medals of all the ACS sections in the country, and he was really gunning for the Nobel Prize. Never got that. He ran for president of the ACS, said derogatory things about his opponent, and got voted down. Always funny. But he was, I enjoyed being with him. He was a likable fellow if you knew him. Others hated his guts, but I always liked him. He was the only MIT ex-faculty member to be murdered, which was too bad.
Right. Now, you mentioned instructor, and I think since we don't really have that position any longer, maybe one or both of you could comment on what the position of instructor was and how it differed from being an assistant professor.
Well, first of all, you had no right to take graduate students. They had to vote. The faculty had to vote so you could take graduate students. So it was strictly a teaching appointment. It lasted 2 or 3 years. And in the Cope sequence, it was 2 years instructor, and then 2 years assistant professor, and 2 years as associate professor, and then a full professor. He didn't like it if you departed from this schedule.
Could you do any research as an instructor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But only by yourself, basically.
Well, you
much.
could take graduate students. They voted. That was no problem.
Mm. Mm.
And I might add that at the time that I came out of the faculty in the end of the summer of 1953, that very season, Cope had hired Herb House from University of Illinois, Norm Nelson, who was at the time a postdoc with Cope, and me. Those 3 organic people came on all at the same time. John Waugh in physical, and Carl Garland in physical, and Dan Lusing in analytical. Six new instructors that particular time. And so Cope had hired 3 organic people when I started. And so maybe that's why this wasn't a very competitive thing at the time of the interview of Sheehan with me. I can't remember whether John even was mentioning these other people.
Now, Art Cope is a giant figure in the history of MIT chemistry. Maybe we should talk a little bit about him. I believe he arrived around 1946, is that right?
I think that was it. Yeah.
So what was he like? And I understand that the role of the head of the department in that period is a lot different from the way it is these days.
Well, what do you remember primarily in your first interactions with Cope?
He called the shots. He was in charge.
That was certainly my impression.
People appeared and disappeared.
Oh.
So there was no requirement that he consult widely with the faculty when making decisions, including even hiring new faculty.
That's right.
I think he hired people at that point in time primarily through the contacts he knew personally. Roger Adams at University of Illinois, and of course he knew Bartlett, and who else would he have known at Harvard? And he would have known Woodward. Woodward was there already, of course, and maybe not of course. Fieser was probably not somebody he would be turning to, because I wouldn't have had any contact really with Fieser. But that's my guess is that that Cope relied on the information he would get by calling people he knew. And he would, of course, called Bartlett, and he would, of course, been in touch with Don Cram, and probably with Saul Winstein, because he would have known me through that time. And I would guess that that's the way he was hiring other people. So if Al Cotton knows Dietmar and he respects Al Cotton, probably that's a big factor.
Al was rather young at that point.
Sure.
Yes.
He was my age.
Yeah. Interesting. So Cope was brought from, I believe, Bryn Mawr, is that correct? From by the upper administration. Columbia.
I think he went from Bryn Mawr to Columbia.
Right.
And he was in there during the war.
So the impression I have is that the administration of MIT brought him in to try to revitalize the department. And
Clean house.
I can imagine that might not have been welcomed by all of the existing faculty at the time.
Well, understatement.
This was before your time by a number of years, but you must have been still some people in the department who didn't get along.
Well, some people didn't get stopped at associate professor. That was the end of their career.
But I should go back and say who was in the organic group.
Sure.
The organic group when I started at MIT. And Cope was a chair, but he was certainly I guess it's always head of the door. So he was the head of the department, and he had brought in John Sheehan and many other positions. I might come back to them in other parts of the department, and he had hired George Buchy and Gardner Swain even before that.
Jack Roberts.
And Jack Roberts had come in a few years, or maybe a couple of years after Gardner Swain. And so Sheehan and Cope was not doing any teaching at the time I came. Sheehan and Buchy and Swain, who am I leaving out of that? I don't think I'm leaving out. So that have the addition of Herb House in synthetic chemistry, and Norm Nelson in sort of natural products, and me in physical organic, more focused towards organic, was a big assist in the teaching at that point.
So who were the inorganic chemists, the older generation, when you and Cotton arrived?
That
Dietmar?
was Walter Shum and Professor Young. He was one of those who didn't get promoted. And that was about it. Inorganic chemistry was married to nuclear chemistry at that time. It was one unit which we all hated because the nuclear chemists didn't know any chemistry. And the chemists didn't know any nuclear science. So the radiochemists, the nuclear chemists, were Charles Coriel and Jack Irvin.
And I should go back also to the three other organic people who were on the faculty.
Sure.
Nick Milas and Avery Morton and Avery Ashdown. Avery Ashdown was active in the teaching prior to me coming, and certainly when I came. He was mainly associated with the laboratory courses, organic laboratory. And Avery Morton was still, no, I shouldn't say still, ran a research group and had done some really interesting, important things in organometallic, enable sodium and things of that sort, and polymerization. And Milas was pretty different. He was sort of removed from the rest of the faculty in personality and other things. He ran a research group and did some important things in
oxidation,
peroxygen compounds, per esters. They had some patented things in that were used industrially. So, but Cope did not allow those people, with the exception of Avery Ashdown, from doing. And Avery didn't do any lecturing. The lecturing of the courses was entirely by the organic people that Cope had brought in. And he did not allow those three to do any teaching. And they were really just kind of isolated, except for Avery Ashdown, who was a big factor in the labs and a pretty big factor at MIT, wouldn't you say?
Oh,
Dietmar?
yeah.
So Milas I know a little of because of my role in terms of safety in the department. I was called in not too many years ago, when a refrigerator was discovered on the roof of Building 6, I believe, which had a number of bottles and flasks with his name on them. And those in the know immediately said, we have to get the bomb squad to dispose of these. Why would that be?
Well, he did a lot of his work with peroxides.
Sounds dangerous.
Yeah, it was dangerous. He had this monumental explosion in his lab. His lab was on the 4th floor there, and he had a lady postdoc from some country in Europe, and she was doing something and stepped out of the lab, and one of her peroxides exploded, a monumental explosion, and Avery Ashdown's office was right opposite this lab, and he stored everything, never threw anything out, so he had an office full of newspapers and journals, and God knows what. Remember that?
I do remember that, and I think he as messy as, well, messy is not quite the
could
word,
find
but a lot of
things.
stuff in that office, and there was undergraduates had some competition at one point to find out which MIT office was the most cluttered. And we thought Avery would win this for sure, but he lost it because in some other professor's office they found an owl underneath, the stuffed owl underneath the material. But
Well, at any rate, this explosion went across the hall and blew Ashdown's stuff all to smithereens. It was a terrible jumble. It never recovered from that.
well, one other thing in that explosion, my office was in 2215, and it looked out on what was that completely enclosed court yard
Yes.
there, and so Milas's thing was down between 2 to 4, and then building 4 up on the 4th floor. And I was talking to somebody in my office, and we heard a pretty big explosion, and I saw the window blow out from what I knew was up in Milas's area. And so I don't think I rushed up to it, but I was conscious that something not good had just taken place up there. But I would be very apprehensive about coming across a refrigerator of his with bottles in it.
So you mentioned, Fred, Avery Morton, and I had heard from the late Jack Roberts some things that weren't entirely positive about Morton's research in organometallic chemistry.
He had some strange ideas about mechanistic chemistry in that area. He thought a lot of things were free radical reactions.
These were alkali metal
Yeah,
organometallic
yeah,
compounds?
In that account by Jack Roberts, where he was relating his experiences up until the point of leaving MIT, perhaps. At least that was a part that was relevant to this session now of going on from when Roberts was there. Roberts was very critical of Avery Morton on several scores, but that none of it seemed to really be touching on what he was doing in the polymerization area, which I think was probably his biggest contribution, wasn't it, Dietmar?
Well, he made other contributions, some that were only recognized later. And this elephant catalyst never was commercialized. I mean, he had this catalyst which polymerized ethylene or butadiene very efficiently to very high molecular weight, but then you had a polymer you couldn't do much with. He had he had a business where he had pop bottles. We put butadiene in the pop bottle. And
The snake.
Squirted in the catalyst, and then it shot out a snake, of polymer.
Yes, I did that several times in the labs. It would not be allowed in the lectures. It certainly would not be allowed now because it was a pentane solution of butadiene, and as Dietmar says, you put the catalyst in it, and it has to be a pretty fresh catalyst. But Ed Lanfer had the company that sold those things, and you could get the whole kit to run this, and you'd put a cork in it when you put the catalyst in. You'd shake the bottle up, and you would know from the timing about when to pull off the stopper. It was getting warm, and then, as Dietmar says, this thing shoots out of the bottle, and the students were so astonished when I did this. Gee, they broke into a standing ovation for this thing, but it was hazardous because all this pentane vapor in it, along with this thing. It never caught fire, but it was.
Well, I inherited Morton's laboratories when he retired in '57, and they were all equipped with fire extinguishers in the hood, automatic fire. They had so many pentane fires, apparently.
Well, they were in organosodium and lithium, so...
Not lithium, sodium.
Sodium. Oh. Yeah. And Milas retired, Ashdown retired around the same time, mid-50s?
Something like that,
I'm not remembering when Ashdown retired. He was still, I think, around right up until the time that he died, wasn't it?
That's right.
And I'm thinking he died at around 80. I could be quite wrong on that. But I do remember that when he died, Lester Hamilton, who was the executive officer of the department, was settling some of his affairs. He was a single person, and I don't know what relatives he had. And I remember Lester Hamilton asking me sometime, well, did I have some interest in a Boston Symphony Orchestra ticket? Because Avery Ashdown did have a ticket, one ticket, because he was going there, but it was in an excellent location, because over the years, I guess he'd moved from one, was a better seat became available for season ticket. And I said, well, I really don't have much use for one tickets, but that was one other thing. That's the only thing I remember about Avery after he died, except for the thing that then I think the building was named for him.
Right.
And I don't know the timing of it.
And his ashes are buried someplace around the building.
Was it Avery Ashdowns that are buried around there? I see. Oh.
Somewhere around MIT.
Around the Ashdown house.
I see.
Well, I don't think anyone these days is aware of that.
Another thing fleetingly about Avery Morton, my strong recollection is that he continued to be physically in very good shape right up to about a point where he was 95, and he did some consulting in these years, numerous years, after his retirement from MIT.
So returning to Art Cope, what was he like as a person? What was his personality like? Other interests? Who did he socialize with in the department?
I have many strong memories of him, almost all favorable from the standpoint of an organic chemistry faculty member. I think that the other divisions of the chemistry, physical in particular, and I'll come back to you on that because I think you're more familiar with that end of the spectrum, Dietmar, in a moment. But from the organic standpoint, or no, just from his personality, he was a very stable person, basically, at least in those early years.
Well, he drank.
He did drink, and that became a problem later. I don't remember that being a problem earlier. And he was an outstanding administrator, basically, and he was a very good scientist. And his research group was one of the stronger groups in that, and he was very encouraging to the younger faculty. He could have had a huge group, but he wanted the graduate students to work to join these younger people, like Herb House and Norm Nelson and me. And so my impressions were that he was a very busy person because he was also active in the American Chemical Society. He was on their board of directors, and then at some point president, and then at some point chairman of the board. After that, those are all sort of later years.
The physical chemists did not care for him at all because they thought physical chemistry was getting the short end of the stick, and that he was favoring organic chemistry by far, which I think was true. Inorganic was small, analytical chemistry was small, but organic chemistry, as Fred said, was booming.